What's going on, everybody? Phoenix here with Totem Audio. If y'all haven't checked out my initial Tympanic Reflex video on YouTube, go check it out because it will cover the basic science of what I'm going to talk about. My intention with this video is to give some deeper science notes on this reflex. For example, the amplitude and time thresholds for this reflex. So I'll cover the basics that I did in the initial video for those who haven't seen it. The basic signal flow in the inner ear is as follows. A sound comes in, it goes through the ear canal, which, fun note, I just recently learned the general resonant frequency of our ear canals is 3 kilohertz. The sound then strikes the tympani or eardrum. That impulse is then transferred to the 3 smallest bones in the body, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. Those bones then nudge the cochlea, which is a small organ in our inner ear. The cochlea delivers the impulses to these fine hairs called cilia and somehow translate that mechanical impulse into an electrical impulse. The cochlea is kind of like the I/O of our body, except instead of voltages to digital, it goes mechanical to voltages. That electrical impulse is then sent to our brain stem and then into our brain, which I won't even go into, but suffice it to say the sound is then heard. There are 2 tiny muscles attached to the tensor tympani called the tensor tympani and the stapedius. These 2 muscles, when exposed to volumes anywhere between 70 and 90 dB, flex and engage a response called the tympanic reflex. Now notice I didn't say 70-90 dB SPL or 70-90 dB FS. I just said dB because what we're referring to here is 70 to 90 dB HL or hearing level, which there's a lot of math involved in converting HL to SPL, but suffice it to say for right now, they are relatively linear. Not exactly, but relatively. HL is just taking into account more of how the human ear perceives loudness at various frequencies as opposed to pure sound pressure measurements. If you're still with me, this is about to get really interesting. Now, when 70 to 90 dB is crossed and the tympanic reflex is engaged, it dulls our sense of loudness. And this is a protective feature so as not to overload the impulses sent to the cochlea. It's essentially like a natural compressor. Now, 70 to 90 dB HL is the threshold for the tympanic reflex. The tympanic reflex takes 50 to 100 milliseconds to fully engage, and about 100 to 200 milliseconds to completely release. Once that threshold is crossed, after about 50 to 100 milliseconds, we are not perceiving the full loudness that's occurring in the sound pressure. This is incredibly important if we're concerned with being perceived as loud. Now, I'm glossing over a lot of science because I'm not a scientist, I'm a producer, but I'm starting to understand the anatomy of what's occurring and it's blowing my mind. For example, I'm kind of glossing over the differences in hearing level SPL. Furthermore, I'm glossing over the point that the tympanic reflex has different responses at different frequencies when exposed to different stimuli and different frequency registers. But I'm doing all this to make a broader point upon which will be built in the future. I truly believe this is really cutting edge early information that we're just now starting to put together. I said in my initial video, I've heard a lot of producers talk about checkerboard and layer cake mixes like we'll talk about in a second. I've heard a lot of audiologists and auditory researchers talk about the tympanic reflex and its different frequency responses. But I've never heard many people put these 2 together so in as far as how it can be applied to producing audio. So let's go deeper. What's the conclusion we can reach with this information? Well, I've coined the phrase the law of loudness. And this won't be found if you type it into Google. It's just my conclusion that I've kind of reached as far from a production standpoint. And the conclusion is this. More dynamic sound is perceived as louder than less dynamic sound when played at equal average loudness. Let me say that again so I know it's with us. More dynamic sound, i.e. a larger ratio of loud to soft, is perceived as more loud than less dynamic music, i.e. a less ratio between loud and soft sounds, when they're played at equal average volumes. If that doesn't go nuclear in your mind, return and revisit what I just said. It's almost the supposition of every sonic creator that the more sound we throw at the canvas, at the wall, the louder it's going to be, right? It's quite counterintuitive when it really sets in for the first time, because you would think that more is louder and less is softer, when really it's a ratio relationship of loud to soft. If you look at a traditional metal song, it's just a sausage. There's very little dynamics to it. If you look at a traditional classical song, it's very dynamic. And you would think if both of those are played back to back on a system at equal average volume, the metal song's going to sound way louder. Another way of saying this is if you take a drum player and put them on stage, and let's say their average volume is -3 decibels SPL, and you take a full band and their average volume is -3 decibels, the drummer is perceived as louder. Why? Because there is a yoking of this tympanic reflex that's going on that is allowing the perceiver to perceive more dynamics than they would if their reflex was constantly engaged, you see. So what does this say for audio creation itself? If we can find small little clever ways of engaging sub-tympanic threshold sounds, i.e. soft sounds or silence altogether, and minute little slivers in our track, it's going to do a constellation of things. First of all, it's going to expand your dynamics. It's going to force dynamics into your music. Furthermore, it's going to yoke this tympanic reflex in the listener where you're perceived as louder because you're actually introducing softer sounds. And I would wager there's actually a pleasure factor to all of this that I'll get into later. And lastly, we're going to minimize the feature that engages ear fatigue. When the tympanic reflex is constantly engaged and just constantly pulling back on that muscle, that's going to be what causes ear fatigue. And when we give that muscle little bits of rest here and there, it's going to, again, do a constellation of things. But lastly, the one is it's going to minimize ear fatigue. Now, a caveat to this is this really only applies to modern styles of music that you're really wanting to be perceived as loud, right? Hip hop, trap, rock, metal, EDM. All of these, generally speaking, the producers of those genres are extremely concerned with being as loud as possible, as jumping out of the speakers as much as possible. If this is something you give a lot of time and attention to, implementing these strategies into your production, not into your mixing or mastering, but into your production, and learning how to sculpt these into your production is quintessential and irreplaceable. And we're going to go into how that's done here in a second. So how do we skillfully insert dynamics into styles of music that historically are so little in dynamics? Well, there's two primary ways I do this in my production. The first is what I call the dynamic slam. We've all probably explored this in broad stroke ways by putting volume utilities on our mix bus and like doing eighth notes, quarter notes, or really fine time domain diced edits. You probably gotten this like exciting sense from this. You can kind of peer in through the window by this method, but it's a very macro way to do it, and it can be difficult to make it tasteful. Whereas if you take those same utilities and you paste them across varying buses and maybe highlight and feature only a few certain sounds that are really soft for 500 milliseconds, a 16th note, a 30-second note, maybe diced across a few 30-second notes, you're going to get much more of a granular effect. Or just having all those utilities on, say, your loudest tracks, say your drums, your bass, and your guitars, and little textures stick out here and there for little 8th bar breaks or 16th bar breaks, where you're dynamically slamming on the loudest instruments and featuring just really soft parts of your songs at any one moment. You can kind of get these cinematic suspensions for a second where you feel hyper real in the audio and then back to the groove. Another way you can achieve this is through what I call the raw dog aux tracks. These could be tracks that are parallel to your mix bus. So maybe an audio track outside of your mix bus that when you slam on your mix bus features maybe a vocal or a short little blip of audio. Here's some examples in some songs I've produced recently. So as you can hear, it not only invites excitement and intrigue into the song, it's forcing little bits of dynamics into the song in really clever and intelligent ways that are modernizing the song. Furthermore, put your headphones or earbuds in with this audio and pay really close attention to what's occurring in your inner ear in those moments of silence. See if you can sense or feel this kind of back pressure feeling. And that, I'm wagering, is the tympanic reflex resetting. You can actually sense anatomically, you can feel a little back pressure sensation when it actually resets. If you've ever had earbuds in that are like blasting music and it just cuts off all in one moment, you can feel this like low rumble almost for a split second, and this like back pressure feeling is the only way I can really describe it in your ear, in your inner ear, and you can feel this thing, this reflex resetting. And I would almost wager that when you kind of yoke this reflex, there's like a pleasure sense that you strike in the brain, almost like sex. That's really interesting to explore from a sound design perspective. So I've heard of this style of production described by guys like Il Gates and Mr. Bill as checkerboard style producing as opposed to layer cake style production. Layer cake being where everything's on top of itself, there's less dynamics to it, as opposed to little bits of tiny sounds or sub-tympanic threshold sounds or silence amidst massive sounds, where that massive sound, when it re-inundates the listener's palate, is fully perceived for a micro moment, whereas it would be dulled, that loudness would be dulled if that tympanic reflex was still engaged when the listener was inundated with that sound. So it's hard for me to state the importance of this information and how deeply it can really influence and affect not only your production and your mixing and your mastering, but your listener's experience of your story and the impact of your story and what it can lend as far as depth of experience that you can achieve of finding, again, little ways to introduce soft sound or silence altogether in micro moments and then full scale sound. This is kind of the most exciting style of production for me. And again, it's not a button you click, it's not a knob you toggle. It's an approach to a style of producing sound and of sonic sculpting, of forcing these dynamics and sculpting these dynamics into your music and using that in a conscious way. So what do you think about all this? Have you experienced this in your listening of sound? Have you experienced the tympanic reflex? Do you like when producers produce in this way that, in my opinion, is like the hyper-modern way, whether rock, whether metal, whether EDM, this is being done? And to me is kind of like the future event horizon of music production. I think our kids are going to know all about this stuff, and it'll be secondhand knowledge. Like, how could you not know about these reflexes that are happening? But we're just now starting to glance at these things and put the anatomy together with the styles of production. So I'd love to hear more producers talk about this. If you're a producer, drop something in the comments below. I'd love to get your thoughts on this. And send me some music of things that you think exemplify this type stuff. Like I've shared with you, explore this in your own space. Do you feel, we are the best litmus test. Before this video, I'm like busting out dB meters and like measuring these responses in my own body, because our bodies are the best litmus test and substrate for testing on these things, being that it's our body in which all these things are occurring, right? So I hope this helps. And as always, if you're interested in having your music professionally produced, drop me a line at the email below. You guys have a great day. Much love. We'll see you soon.